So welcome, I'll get started and then hopefully some other people will join. Welcome to this session. Good afternoon. I just want to start by saying a quick thank you to our sponsors. Without them, this whole event wouldn't be possible. So this session is called Funding Research in Low and Middle Income Countries, the Challenges and Considerations. And I'd like to now introduce our hosts, Claire and Barbara from Cures Within Reach, who will be hosting this session.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen now and make the transition. Hopefully you all can see this.
Yeah.
Excellent. So thank you so much. I'm Barbara Goodman, the president and CEO of Cures Within Reach. Claire Thibodeau is joining me and she'll be speaking in just a couple minutes. First, I want to thank Beacon so much and the entire rare disease community for inviting us today. We're thrilled to be a part of this conversation and excited to share our learnings and things we've been up to in low and lower middle income countries. So as a brief overview, Cures Within Reach, we are a US-based nonprofit organization that focuses in repurposing research. Specifically, we leverage the speed, safety, and cost effectiveness of testing already approved therapies. They have regulatory approval in any country, whether it's from the FDA, whether it's from the EMA or another organization, and we find and fund clinical trials to test these already approved therapies in new indications. We have found it to be the fastest way to true patient impact is using already approved therapies. We are disease agnostic, we are geography agnostic, and we are institution agnostic. In our over 12 years of history funding and focusing on clinical repurposing and repurposing overall, we have funded over 100 projects now. And our $7 or $8 million in funds that we have given to our partner institutions has helped to leverage 76 million in follow-on funding. We focus on the catalytic impact that our funds provide. And what exactly does that mean for us? We are not, as an organization, funding to the finish line. We call our sweet spot of funding the come back when funds. We fund very often the first in human, the proof of concept, the phase 1, perhaps a phase 2A study, but that early data with a very small number of patients that if it is successful, other funders will often come in and fund the follow-on, whether it's the NIH in the United States, whether it's other nonprofits, whether it's industry. But our funds provide the catalytic impact so the researcher and clinician can say, here's a small data set, will you fund the follow-on study? And then the larger confirmatory study. What's important to know about our funding model is we are indifferent to the next path. If there is commercial value and an industry player picks it up and brings it to regulatory approval, that's great. But just as important are those projects that have little or no commercial value. And we call those our philanthropic projects. Those are just as important to us as a nonprofit. We're focused on building a pipeline of treatment options for patients with unmet medical needs and unsolved diseases. We often talk about repurposing versus repositioning. So just a quick clarification for us. Repositioning are drugs or devices that have had some phase 1, phase 2, perhaps a phase 3 study done, but they never reached all the way to a regulatory approval, and companies or researchers are looking to use them in a different indication. We consider that repositioning because it never had regulatory approval. And I've already discussed the philanthropic and commercial side. For those of you who are not deeply aware of repurposing, the reason it is so exciting for us and the focus of our mission and work at Cures Within Reach is because it is a faster way to patient impact. It's a cheaper way to patient impact for a number of different reasons along the clinical trial path. But that's really important to us as we look at our research. I'm going to cover at a very high level some of the projects that we have ongoing, and then Claire will dive a little bit more deeply into our work in low and lower middle income countries. So as you can see, we currently have funding at 35 different clinical and preclinical projects around the world, at 30 different institutions and 28 different diseases, mostly US, but certainly a number of other countries around the world as well. Half of our projects right now are in rare diseases. No surprise to anyone in the rare disease space, but we do cover a number of other disease areas. There's obviously some overlap with rare oncology and rare neurology, but we do have a number of other disease areas that we focus on. And as this slide shows, we have about 2/3 of our projects in adults, 1/3 of our projects are in pediatrics today. Over 90% of our projects are in the clinical space, which a very small amount are in the preclinical space as well. And while most of our work is in the pharmaceutical drug side, we do have a number of projects in devices, diagnostics, combination projects, and others. Specifically in the rare disease side, as one can imagine, we've got a lot of different rare disease specific projects. It's a lot of different types of cancers, infectious diseases, neurodegenerative diseases like Huntington's disease, have a couple projects in sight impairment diseases as well, across a number of different population communities and geographies as well. And finally, in terms of the non-US projects, it is just under 20% of our portfolio today. And while it does include a project in the United Kingdom where Beacon is based, as well as Germany and a couple others, we do have 3 ongoing projects that we're going to talk about and highlight in the conversation today in Nigeria, Kenya, and Vietnam. And with that very fast, quick overview, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Claire Thibodeau to talk about what we have specifically in LMICs today.
Thanks, Barbara. And I just want to start off by echoing your thanks to Beacon for having us here today. We're very excited to share our experiences of funding in low and lower middle income countries, or LMICs, kind of what we've learned, and then have a discussion about that after. So as Barbara mentioned, we have 35 ongoing trials right now. In addition to those, we have also, we have 10 projects that have been selected and are yet to start. So they're in our pipeline, so to speak. These are in a variety of different diseases, including several rare diseases. In addition to what's already been selected and funded, we have some new funding opportunities coming out in 2022. Our first one was just announced last week, and this is in the space of both rare diseases and diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this is minority researchers who are based in the US, or researchers in the US who are looking at health disparities in rare diseases. So if anybody who's watching this has connections in the United States who are interested in applying for this funding, we encourage them to reach out to us to learn more. And we'll be sharing our email addresses at the end of this presentation, or you can contact us at research@cureswithinreach.org. We do have a couple other funding opportunities that are also US based coming out this year, both focused again on diversity, equity, inclusion. But what we really want to talk about today is our Regrow program. This year, we are expecting to start year 3 of Regrow, which is short for Repurposing Grants for the Rest of the World. And this is an effort that we started thinking about actually in 2018, when we were working with some of our funding partners who said, you know, you have a really great model in repurposing research that's helped patients and advanced repurposing in the United States and Europe. What if we were to take this model and put it in low and lower middle income countries, where we could not only find repurposed therapies for those patients, but also build capacity for repurposing research in these countries. So what we did was we first started with a group of stakeholders that came from a number of different areas, from academia, from global health, from industry and others. And we got together and kind of started to flesh out what this might look like. At the same time, we said, all right, well, let's kind of dip our toes a bit in funding for LMICs and start with any project that can impact these patients, which led to our first funding effort in 2019, part of our Cure Accelerator Live for the Developing World event. And for those of you who aren't familiar with our Cure Accelerator Live event, just very briefly, it's an exciting philanthropic pitch event where the PIs will and the researchers will come and they will put together a 7-minute, 8-minute presentation that will be shown to the attendees to the event. We have an expert panel who will ask questions about the project. And then at the end of the evening, everyone who's in attendance gets to vote on the winning project. And the winner is announced either that day or early the next day as the winner of the grant. So it's really exciting. It's a fun way to bring projects and repurposing research to a more public community. So we did this first effort in 2019, and what it really allowed us to do was start building relationships with trusted organizations in LMICs who are working in global health to help us make those connections and start to build those relationships. In addition, it showed us the potential for patient impact that this kind of funding could provide. So as you'll see on the next slide, we really put the learnings that we got from our diverse group of stakeholders, the relationships that we started building through Cure Accelerator Live, and officially launched in late 2019, Regrow. Again, these were repurposing grants specifically for PIs based in low and lower middle income countries. And based on the feedback that we gotten through our planning sessions, we did have some parameters that we decided on for this pilot first year. And that was, it could be any disease from any LMIC. We didn't know what we didn't know, so we wanted to cast a wide as net as possible. But at the same time, we knew that we had to have some parameters. And when we were talking about the parameters, what we wanted to do was use parameters that were already existing in the global health space. And this was really helpful for two reasons. First of all, we didn't need to recreate the wheel if there were already good measures and metrics out there. But then also it gave kind of a common language to our funding opportunity. When we said, these are low and lower middle income countries as defined by the World Bank, then everybody kind of would understand what that meant. Or if we said that institutions needed to follow guidelines set by the WHO, again, everybody kind of knows what that is. So it's not Cures Within Reach making these parameters and guidelines. We're doing what other people have already done and what is proven effective. So as you'll see on the next slide, we had a really great response to our pilot. We received 34 submissions, proposal submissions from 12 different countries on 4 continents. We engaged a number of reviewers to help us vet and rank these submissions. And in the end, we narrowed it down to our first 3 selected projects from LMICs. We've got 3 projects going on right now in 3 different countries in 3 disease areas, one of which is in rare. So we do have a pediatric rare liver disease being studied in Vietnam. We also have tuberculosis in Nigeria. And another project that, again, shows how important geography is. People in high income countries may not really think about snakebite as an important public health issue, but in a country such as Kenya, it can be. And so we are funding a repurposing project to help combat snakebite in Kenya specifically. So we're very proud to get these started. We're very excited to see where this research will lead in the future. And following this success in 2020, I'm getting ahead of myself, we are very pleased to launch 2021 year 2. So this is a funding opportunity that closed last summer. Again, we were really thrilled by the response we got, 24 proposals from 10 countries on 3 continents. Once again, we put this through our system and narrowed it down and selected 3 trials for funding. So these are part of our 10 that are still in our pipeline. Once we have all the agreements finalized, we will be able to share these with our community. So what I really want to draw your attention to on this map is the different places where our submissions have come from throughout the LMIC community. And you can see there are dots on 4 continents, South America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. But you may also notice that a lot of the dots are concentrated in Africa. And this goes to show the importance of creating strong partnerships with organizations that either work in these countries or have relationships with the institutions in these countries. You can really see how our strong ties to partners in Africa can then translate into success for those researchers who find out about our funding, apply to our funding, and then eventually are awarded funding. So speaking of our researchers and successes, I just want to make one kind of final point before we dive into some of our best practices and learnings, is that for all of our projects at Cures Within Reach, we really measure success over a continuum of time. You know, we know that success isn't just one thing or another, but it can happen in many points along the pathway of a project while it's ongoing, as well as after a project. It sort of has a bit of a ripple effect. And so not only for our ongoing projects, but for our regrow projects, we'll continue to check in with our PIs, see what's happened, see what's doing, so we can really understand the impact of this catalytic funding that Barbara described. So it could be from whether or not the trial itself met its primary outcome to, you know, are there ongoing trials now that are going to follow up and be a larger confirmatory trial, all the way through to, is this project now making patient impact more broadly? So we look forward over the years to see what our regrow projects will do, and we encourage you to stay tuned and learn with us with those. So again, that is just a very quick overview of what we've done in regrow. I think what we were hoping at this point was that we would be able to talk about some lessons learned and then open it up to discussion. So some of these lessons learned we kind of talked about already during the presentation. The first is represent many stakeholders' perspectives. And this is not only in the planning process that we talked about, where we got a group together, heard from them, incorporated their suggestions, and kind of defined what regrow might look like. But then also when it comes to reviewing the projects, do you have a broad perspective? Is it academia? Is it industry? Is it philanthropy? And most importantly, are you representing patient voice or folks who work in the global community? Maybe they don't have an intense scientific background, but they know what works and doesn't work when it comes to global health. Again, other people's eligibility measures, again, very important to create that kind of common language that researchers can understand when they're applying, that organizations that are helping us with outreach can understand when we're explaining the project, and people who are interested in funding regrow and helping us grow can understand as well. And engaging supportive organizations, very, very important. As I showed you with that map, you know, in Africa especially, you can see the outcome there. Cures Within Reach, we are still always looking to engage more organizations. So if anybody who is watching this is interested in learning more, wants to know how they can help with outreach or be a supportive organization, please contact us. We'd love to add you to our mailing list and have a conversation about that. Again, kind of think about the scope in both broad and narrow. You know, we talked about how we didn't know what we didn't know, so we wanted to have this wide net that would kind of capture what we didn't know. So we didn't want to restrict it to one disease area or two disease areas. We wanted to make sure that we could capture all the different areas that PIs and researchers in low and lower middle income countries felt were important to their community, what their community needed. At the same time, we do have to have certain guardrails to make sure that the research is applicable to those patients. For example, generic. We wanted to keep the drugs to generic drugs. We were also open to nutraceuticals and indigenous medicine, but they all had to be available in that particular country. You know, the last thing that we wanted to do was fund research that then couldn't be taken advantage of by patients in that country. I'll let Barbara kind of finish us out and talk about a few other points that we have not yet discussed.
Great. Thanks, Claire. I think from the organizational perspective, everything that Claire has already said really kind of melds right into the last bullet points on this slide. We had to really rethink our legal agreements with our partner research institutions for things that we had never needed to consider before, and things like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. We had foreign currency questions. We needed to make sure we were transferring funds in US dollars. And while we have had over the years projects in Germany and Australia, the foreign currency fluctuations certainly are a lot more limiting than any risk or exposure. So a lot of phrasing and sections in the legal agreements had to be considered, insurance considerations, things like that. So making sure not only our legal agreements were updated to capture some of the issues in LMICs, but then we wanted our grant applications to be considered and adapted to that. We added a video, upload a video to an application for the first time ever. And we've actually used that beyond LMICs as well, asking specific questions related to LMICs that actually really work well across the board as well. And as one can imagine, there's a lot more complex payment and banking information needed in terms of we usually cut checks or do ACH transfers within the United States, but that's not possible when you're dealing with LMICs. So having a banking system that can manage international transfers, trace international transfers when there might be some blips is important, and it's certainly a little bit more complex, but certainly worth it from our perspective as well, and strengthening our organization as well as building the capabilities for LMICs. And then finally, being flexible in terms of communication styles and emails. It never occurred to us until we did Regrow and the LMIC project that personal email addresses become official email addresses. And we have learned that for some institutions in Africa and some other countries, they use Gmail emails, for example, as their communication method for a number of different reasons. We were used to requiring an institutional looking email address, and you have to be flexible and understanding. How long it takes people to respond to emails can be different. It's not always different, but it can be. So just having the flexibility and being willing to adapt your system to a new model, open-mindedness is really important. And all of these issues, the ones that I covered, and certainly the ones that Claire talked about already, because we had open dialogue with so many different stakeholder communities, we had done a lot in advance and kind of opened our arms to people that had been doing this. We had never funded at Cures Within Reach, we had never funded low and lower middle income countries before 2019, 2020 when this launched, and having trusted supportive organizations that we could turn to say, how do you do this? How does this work was integral to the success of year one, and certainly as we launched year two last year. So we're really grateful for people being willing to share their best practices, and now we're giving back and having this session today. So with that, we're gonna kind of stop talking and open up the dialogue and let you ask your questions and certainly make this as interactive as we can. from a Zoom perspective. So are there any questions, comments?
Sophia, great. Thank you so much for that, Claire and Barbara.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that, actually. Thank you very much. So I was wondering, I saw that a lot of this connects a lot to what you were saying about communications, but I saw that a lot of your submissions were restricted to Anglophone countries. For example, last year I was working in Senegal, and I know that like the vast majority of people won't speak English. So I was wondering if that was like an issue for submissions and if you're doing anything to overcome that.
Yeah, that's a really great question. That is something that we discussed a lot actually during the planning sessions. And we realized that, you know, there is certain language differences through different countries in different continents. Not everybody speaks English. So the way that we've addressed it at this point is that we often encourage PIs and researchers who may not speak English or may not be as fluent in English to work with a partner who can apply on their behalf and work through us that way. We did have one submission actually that that came last year from a country, a French-speaking country and researcher who then partnered with somebody in Kenya. And the researcher in Kenya took over the duties of going through the application process and communicating with Cures Within Reach. Sometimes we find that these researchers have partnerships with researchers in the UK or in the United States or other countries, and we sort of work through those intermediaries. So in the short term, this is how we've been addressing it. It is a process that we're working through, and eventually we'd like to expand it up to an application that can accept in multiple languages. And that is something that we can do as we grow and we adapt over time.
If you had, if you encountered people who maybe didn't already have those Anglophone connections, was there anything you could do to facilitate it?
Yeah, actually, it's interesting. We actually looked at that topic, not just from a language barrier, but much broader, is certainly an opportunity to do kind of matching of clinicians and researchers that have already done this type of thing with those who want to engage. So we actually see that not just from a language and connection, but one of the ways we want to expand and build is to do some proactive matching of resources, not just language, but for those institutions that may not already have. It's not required for you to have an institution partner, but for those that don't, maybe we can proactively do that. And we've had ongoing conversations with our stakeholder partners to begin to do that. We chose to kind of start slow and small, and then do things like mentoring and that type of activity as we grow years 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yeah. And I would also add too that was also one of the reasons why we added the video portion of the application, because we understood that, you know, that it's not just either somebody doesn't know English or they do know English. There's various levels of English proficiency. So we wanted to give researchers the opportunity who may be more comfortable communicating verbally via English rather than written. And the video is that opportunity to talk about their project and describe it and express their enthusiasm and the potential impact in a way that doesn't involve completing a more formal application.
Yeah, cool. So that's really interesting. And I was wondering if your plans for these kind of mentoring projects are going to expand outside of the 3 submissions that are granted the funds. Will that be like a wider program that occurs alongside this?
Yeah, that was actually discussed as well during our first year, is let's start, once we start doing the matching, let's start with our funded researchers and then eventually expand, probably not to all the proposal submissions, but the proposal submissions that were strong, that just needed a little bit, that had potential in future, we could do that at the next level. So we don't see that happening in the very short term in the next year or two, but certainly that's on the radar and was a discussion topic in our planning for a couple of years. Absolutely. So you could have joined the planning sessions. Certainly been additive.
Yep.
I have a couple of questions on different topics. So I'm kind of interested in, you mentioned like how you measure success over time and how that's something important to you. And I agree that it's critical basically. And I was wondering if that's if you leave that down to the people who are granted the funds, or if that's something that's carried out by Cures Within Reach, or if it's a joint effort.
Yeah. I actually think it's quite interesting that the fundraising person is asking that, because that's a critical conversation we have. How do we measure success, and how do we tell that story to our philanthropic partners? So I'll let Claire answer in detail, but it's a critical component of Cures Within Reach big picture. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And Sophia, you really hit the nail on the head when you talked about a combination approach. So we do, during the course of a project, any project, we have 6-month reporting where we get updates from the researchers, not only on the progress of the research. There are also financial check-ins to make sure that the funds are being spent appropriately. And those are all very standard for most researchers who get a grant, and there's some deal of reporting while it's going on. I think what's really critical is what happens when the grant ends and the project ends. At Cures Within Reach, we follow up every year with the researchers with a very simple form for them to fill out. We try and make it as easy as possible. We don't want to create more work for them. So just some basic questions about what's happened with the research since we stopped funding it and the project ended. But then on the other side too, Cures Within Reach keeps in touch through the internet. We do our internet searching. We have our resources that we can look to find any kind of information and follow on and updates, because we all know that researchers are very busy people. Sometimes they don't include everything. And what we found is that when we do see something, whether it's a publication, whether it's a presentation, whether it's a grant, and then we've reached out to our researchers and said, hey, this looks like something that was connected to your project. Can you tell us a little bit more about it? They're more than happy to respond to us that way too. So it is very much a two-way street. I think they're also really excited to know that we still care. It's part of that too, that we are still really invested in what they're doing, and they're not just, okay, we're going to fund you and then move on to the next project, We want to know. And I found that researchers really like that, and they actually respond. They don't see it as us kind of checking in on them or trying to, say, oh, you left this out of your report, but wow, you guys are really going the extra step. You care. So that's it's actually kind of a nice relationship builder with our funded researchers beyond when we funded them.
Cool. I'm gonna let Mayro go ahead, I think.
Great, Mary Rose.
Yeah, so I had a question about the patient participation in these kind of projects. So one of the things we hear from our patient groups a lot is about how they can best support the actual participation of their community in these kind of studies. And I would think that the kind of challenges involved in that area, how do you provide the support in terms of travel and accommodation and those people taking the time off work? I would think all those kind of issues would be exacerbated in lower income countries. So I'm wondering what kind of support structures exist within these projects to help that angle in these studies.
Yeah, I'm going to have Claire start on the specific projects, and then I'm going to share an example of what we're doing completely outside of low and lower middle income countries to begin to tackle that in a very different way. I'll share that after Claire, though.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the points that we wanted to address through Regrow is how do we get the community, the patients in these countries invested and involved in the clinical trials. So there's kind of two pieces to that. The first is, are the clinical trials being conducted by someone from the community, someone that's known and trusted, that looks like them, that talks like them, that really understands them. And that's why instead of Cures Within Reach funding like the Johns Hopkins or the University of Liverpool, and then having them do the research in low and lower middle income countries, why we wanted to go directly to Kenya and Vietnam and Nigeria and fund those PIs. So that, I think, is the first step. And Barbara's going to talk about this a little bit more too, about getting that kind of community engagement. And then in terms of, travel and stipends, that is very important to these projects. And Cures Within Reach does allow that in our funding that we provide. So many times as part of the budget, we'll see patient stipends, transportation, other patient educational materials that may come through. So that is all allowable. Those are all things that Cures Within Reach funding can be used for, in addition to the specific clinical research. I think that our PIs in low and lower middle income countries know that this engagement is really important. And, sometimes at their universities themselves, universities will have resources. They will have the ability to supplement what we're doing, either with dollars, with connections, with some other support to help make these trials successful.
And then the other interesting dynamic that we're starting in this year, we started it late last year, is it's US based only, but I think there's going to be some really intriguing learnings and opportunity to take it well beyond our US trials. And that is in the United States, we started last year an effort for, as Claire mentioned earlier, health disparities trials. These are the racial and healthcare inequities that are going on with communities of color in the United States and in other places. But we have funding specifically to, alongside of our clinical trials, to fund community-based organizations that are both healthcare community-based organizations and social services organizations. So food pantries, for example, as well as local healthcare organizations that never really get involved with clinical trials. They're not doing the clinical trials, but touch the people who are potential enrollees for these clinical trials. And we're starting to do this in the United States. It's our pilot year where we're requiring community-based engagement for a small portion of our trials in the United States, specifically working on health disparities, so that communities of color are better engaged, more thoughtfully engaged, and not just in the enrollment process, but understanding how the trial go and what does the trial results say for that community short term within where the trial happened, but certainly longer term, if it is successful, what's the opportunity beyond just that local clinical trial. So we are, with intentionality, going after a little piece of that, at least in the United States in a pilot year. It's our first year there, but we started with regrow, as Claire already said, in 2019, and we're now at year 3. So we see there's a real opportunity to take some learnings that we're doing right now in the United States and perhaps extend it elsewhere. So it's an interesting time, at least in the United States, with community-based engagement and how we in healthcare interact with patients and with prospective clinical trial enrollees. I think there's a lot of changes going on, and we're excited to be a part of it. Is that helpful?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, Barbara. And I think the thing you mentioned there with the trials in the USA, I think a lot of these research studies kind of look at patients as just a number in an Excel spreadsheet. And it sounds like what you're doing is actually focusing on the people as people. They've got other things that aren't just their condition going on in their lives that need to be addressed as well. And by addressing those things, you're helping them to participate in these studies. So I think, yeah, that kind of holistic approach to participation is really, really important. So yeah, thank you, Barbara.
Yeah, and I think, Claire already mentioned this, but I want to drive this home because we really see an opportunity, not just with our work in the LMICs, but our work in other places in the United States, by focusing on underserved and underrepresented researchers. In the United States, they may be racial and ethnic minorities, but they're certainly not minorities in Africa. They're just underserved. There's not enough funds that have gone to them. And we are specifically funding these researchers in LMICs. In the United States, we're specifically funding the underrepresented racial and ethnic minorities, so that, as Claire already said, researchers, the heads of these clinical trials, look like them. It makes sense. There's a very different dynamic with a patient and enrollment opportunities when these are people that look like you, sound like you, understand the dynamic in a very different way. And we hope that that is continuing to be successful in our work in LMICs and in other geographies as well, because it's important.
And Mary Rose, I'd just like to add one other thing, and this isn't about the trial themselves, but in how the process that we use to select the trials. And I did mention this earlier, but it was very brief. And again, as Barbara said, I want to make sure I really drive this home, is that we include the patient voice, the community voice, the global health voice, when it comes to which projects we select for funding. So at our review process, we always make sure to include that perspective because, you know, it's the rare disease community knows very well. Sometimes what researchers think might be a good idea or a good endpoint or a good symptom to study, it is not as important or not the main focus of a patient. So to have that perspective, provide that feedback to our researchers as they're going through the application process so that they can modify, they can take that in, they can make changes as needed and work to create a research project that's going to be better, not only science-wise, but also for the patients. We do incorporate that into our process as well.
Brilliant. Thanks, Claire. That sounds like a brilliant example and model for other organizations to follow as well.
Yep.
I was wondering how you like how these people find out about your grant program. Like, how do you get into these communities for them to then know that, okay, we can apply here? Have you got, just wonder what your method for that was.
It's partners like Beacon. Spread the word. You got to have supportive organizations everywhere. So that's an example.
Yep.
Claire?
For LMICs, we have a great partnership with Global Health Catalyst, which is a group out of Johns Hopkins, Baltimore area. They were formerly at Harvard, but again, going back to that map where you see all the different applications and where they came from, they have very strong connections in Africa. And so through them, they have helped us. And that's why we know that while we have some really strong partners and relationships now, we need to keep building those so that we can reach all the different countries out there. There are lots of LMICs out there, and we want to make sure, and we know that there are lots of repurposing research projects in need of funding. So the more relationships we have, the more connections we build, the more friends that we make along the way, the more effective we can be.
And I think another great example to that is the Vietnam project that got mentioned earlier that is ongoing, that was funded in the first year. That's a project that Cures Within Reach actually was involved in the earlier, smaller study, connected through a US-based research institution. And when this funding opportunity came out a couple of years ago now, the US researcher forwarded it on to her global health partner that happened to be based in Vietnam, and that got connected to us. So, we're using our network of funded researchers, partner institutions across the United States and across other countries. This happens, we have a project, our first project in Spain got connected to us through a funded researcher from a different country. So our network of partner institutions, research institutions, and funded researchers is critical in not just for our work in LMICs, but all of our calls for proposals.
Yeah, of course. And it makes sense, isn't it? And that's exactly why we're doing this international event, because, with research trials, but also especially with rare disease, it's important to have these connections with our small patient communities. Like we need to be able to cross borders, and every time I find you make a connection, you can then make 3 more, which is, I think, obviously really important. Sophia, I saw you unmuted earlier. Did you have some more good questions?
I just had a little one, going back a bit, sorry, but we were talking about the patient voice. And I was just curious about, obviously you say you try to use it as much as possible when you're making your decisions, whether that be like monitoring success or, granting funds. But I was wondering, in your like lower income countries, does that always have to come through the clinician, or have you found a way to directly interact with the patients?
Yeah, so for the regrow projects, we are still making those connections. We are figuring out the best connections to have. So when it comes to the patient community voice, for those, typically we go through global health programs that have connections to specific patients in those countries, that have worked with patients in those countries, or have done work in those countries specifically, and they kind of act as a surrogate. Part of the challenge too with regrow is that when you're open to any disease and you have lots of different diseases, it's hard to have specific patients for each particular disease. So in that case, what we've been relying on initially is building that kind of proxy system of somebody who's not from a scientific background, but has worked with patients in these countries to improve public health overall, and that have firsthand experience working with patients, and asking them to kind of represent the patient voice. As Barbara said, as we grow and expand and we build even more relationships in these countries, we can start to then connect more specifically with patients in LMICs everywhere.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I see it as a really big challenge. I remember when I was living in Senegal, and I was working with this girl whose aunt had, I think it was sickle cell, but she couldn't read any of the notes that her doctor gave her. So I just feel like it would be so difficult for like someone at Cures Within Reach in the United States to be able to connect with, someone in rural Senegal who can't read or write or necessarily speak the same language.
Right. And thankfully, we're not responsible for that. We're not doing the clinical trials. We're not doing the enrollment. We're selecting the researcher in, for example, in Senegal. So we're reliant on that relationship. Thankfully, that's not what we're doing. But I think the community voice, just like we think about if we have a call for proposals in any rare disease, like Claire mentioned, we just launched one this week. It's open to any rare disease. We're not going to be able to get patient representatives for every single disease of 20 submissions or 30 submissions. We try and bring people who have a rare disease perspective and can think about rare disease patients broadly. And we do the same thing with our LMIC program.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we had an incredible panel session earlier. When you guys are going back and checking out the talks, I would definitely check out the Africa panel. They were talking a lot about like this idea of like self-advocacy and the importance of like multi-stakeholder approaches and collaboration. And I think it's just the key in everything rare. We just need to keep making these connections. But if no one has any more questions, we're at the end of our time slot. But I want to say a massive thank you, Barbara and Claire. It was like really interesting and really informative. And I'm sure we'll have some really good stuff that we can potentially use later on. So
thank you for having us. It's a pleasure to be with you
so much.
today.